As I said in the prayer, we're Acts chapter 12, and man, this Bible looks very bright. I am so glad I can read it easier. That's great. Acts chapter 12. We're actually only going to go through 5 or 6 verses tonight. And this is intentional because there's a lot of verses that come after this you have to read together. And actually verse 5 ends the paragraph, but we're probably going to dip into verse 6 tonight. And then it's going to be like you remember as growing up when we didn't have DVR and everything on TV, and at the end of the show you see to be continued ... going through. Where there's going to be a to be continued till next week, and it's going to be kind of a cliffhanger if you've never read this before. And I tell you, I'm not going to encourage you not to read it so you can be surprised next week. I'm going to encourage you to read it this week and see what happens and how God moves. All right, beginning in verse 12, chapter 12, verse 1, I mean. Now about the time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And what's the time that's going on here? This is not only a time of a famine that we just read about that in chapter 11, the famine that they collected money for and to take care of the church in Jerusalem. Well, at this time, King Herod decided that he was going to do something to make the Jews happy, so he began to persecute the church. And he didn't just put them in jail just to make people happy. He had an intention when he did this. It was to mistreat them. This guy was probably the king of jerks, right? They bought him at the jerk store. He was the #1 bestseller. Because Herod Agrippa. He's Herod Agrippa, the son of Herod the Great. We know about Herod the Great. He was this is around 44 to 47 A.D., and you know who was a king and an emperor at that time? He was made king by the emperor during that time. You ever heard the name Caligula? One of the most vile, nastiest leaders the Roman Empire ever had. He killed people just for the fun of it. And I think that because he was that kind of guy, he had those kind of guys with him. And even if you weren't that kind of guy, if you were politically expedient, you became that kind of guy to make Caligula like you. So that's kind of what was going on. That's not kind of what was going on. That's exactly what was going on this time. Herod, he was Herod Agrippa. The Syriac so renders express. The chronology requires us to understand that he is the grandson of Herod the Great and one of the sons of Aristobulus, who Herod put to death. Herod the Great left 3 sons between the kingdom. It was divided: Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. And you can see that in Matthew 2:19. To Philip was left Irita and Trachota. I can't even pronounce these places. But Archelaus was being accused of cruelty and banished by Augustus to Vienna and Gaul, and Judea was reduced to a province until united with Syria. When Philip died, his region was granted by the Emperor Caligula to Herod Agrippa. And that's how he got his power. And we know that when he got his power, he continued on. You know, everybody wants to impress the boss, right? Well, that's what he was doing. He was impressing the boss. So he extended his hand to the power to injure the church as much as possible. You know, the King James. What does the King James say? I know some of y'all have the King James. This says mistreat in my version. What does yours say? Vex. That's kind of a descriptive term, isn't it? Vex. Annoy. This is more than annoy. It was just it was almost fun for him, I think. It's the idea of vexing somebody. It wasn't just punishing somebody. It was going over the top. Kind of like, little brothers do big brothers and vice versa. My little brother used to do that to me all the time. And he knew, my dad told me, he says, you hurt him, I hurt you. That's what my dad told me about my little brother. So he knew that, and he would just vex me. And I was a little sensitive little baby back then. And he would pick on me and just come at me all he could. And he knew when I got mad, I'd get in trouble. And he'd call me pig. And I got skinny later on in life, then I got piggish again later on, as I'm at now. But it hurt my feelings. And I would get saying, don't call me pig. But he would just vex me with that. It's just that kind of, it's not just doing something mean to somebody. It's doing something mean and having fun doing it. It's not. It says, Clark said, to vex the church, that is to destroy its chief ornaments and sports. It is tried to destroy it completely. It wasn't just about beating you. It was about beating you down. Recently in a football game, some of you may have heard about it around here. At the end of the ball game, the team lost pretty badly. And the other team told the team as they're walking on the field, basically telling them, says, if y'all can't play any better than this, you might as well go kill yourself. Some of you may have heard that. It's happened in this community and area recently. That's kind of the idea of vexing. They didn't just beat them at football. They wanted to destroy them emotionally and mentally. And that's the kind of attitude that King Agrippa had. It's just, that was completely uncalled for. And if I were the AD, that football team's season would be done. It would just be finished. I mean, of course, some people would rather win than be righteous. Guzik said, stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. No doubt this was done because it was politically popular for Herod. It pleased many of the citizens who didn't like Christians. Many political figures are ready to persecute Christians if they can make them politically popular. Oh my goodness. We don't have time to talk about that today, do we? I'm not going to call any political parties out right now. I'm not going to call their name. There's a particular political party in our country that will damn a Christian every chance they get, and talk about how Christians they talk about how they want to support women and all these women's rights. We want women to have so much right they can just kill babies indiscriminately, but yet they want to support Muslims who treat women less than dogs. Why are they doing that? To make political hay. I don't understand it. It just blows my mind that they would support a religion which I would say is a false religion, and we believe that because we believe the Bible, that treats women, I'm going to move on before I get upset. It just irritates me. And verse 2, and he had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. James is murdered here. This isn't execution, a legitimate execution. I am a proponent of the death penalty. I believe that life is so valuable that if someone takes a life, taking the life of someone who kills somebody is legitimate. If you don't understand, go read right after the flood what God tells Noah. Life is so valuable that we have to have a great response to that. I'm a proponent of the death penalty for murder. But this isn't what that is. He just killed him for the fun of it. Oh, he's a Christian. Let's just kill him. Let's make him an example. Get him down. He's dead now. Now, he did signify which James it was, because this isn't Jesus' brother, who was the head of the church. I don't know why James was picked out. Maybe because he was, son of Barjonas. He was the son of thunder. Maybe he had a big mouth. Maybe he was bold and brash. I don't know. We don't know why he chose him. But it's also not James, son of Alphaeus either, which was also called James the Lesser. It wasn't him either, but he was the first apostle to be martyred. Guzik said James was certainly not the first Christian to die in faithfulness to Jesus. We know Stephen had died already in Acts 7. He was martyred before this, and certainly others after, but the death of James shattered the illusion that somehow the 12 enjoyed a unique divine protection. I just think about these gentlemen who stand in their big churches and take money from poor widows and fly in their big jets and have their big boats and think they're invincible because they're preachers or pastors of the gospel. That's just not true. I'm not going to go on too long on that. By killing with a sword, Clark said that the beheading among the Jews, there were 4 kinds of death. One is stoning, burning, killing with the sword, or beheading, and strangling. Some say maybe he wasn't beheaded, but That's probably what happened. They probably lopped his head off right in front of everybody to make him an example. That's kind of what Caligula did, things like that. So it wasn't, and that was kind of he did this knowing that was one of the ways the Jews did things to please them. The third was a Roman as well, and a Jewish mode of punishment. Killing the sword was the punishment which, according to the Talmud, was inflicted by those who drew away people to any strange worship. James probably was accused of this, and hence the punishment mentioned in the text. They just lopped his head off. Now, we see what happens next is that, and actually in verse 3. It's when he saw that it pleased the Jews. He's like, I'm making some hay now. Let's have some more fun. He says, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. Now what does the King James say? No, at the end of it, when it was. It says unleavened bread. Some versions say, that's actually in the next verse. Never mind. Unleavened bread. So we know what goes on. That's during the Passover time. And we'll find, in the next verse you'll see it says Easter, but we'll talk about that in a second. Now, what crime did Peter commit? No crime whatsoever. He was doing this to please the Jews. Jesus says there's a significant difference between the persecution of Saul of Tarsus and from Herod. Saul, wrong as he was, Saul persecution out of sincere thought, misguided religious conviction. Herod persecuted out of pure political motives. He's saying, we can almost respect what Paul was doing because he had a reason. He thought he was doing right. Now we know he was wrong, and he found out he was wrong, and God called him out of it. But there was no real reason for this. Jesus said, but Jesus promised no special protection for even his closest followers. He warned them to be ready for persecution. Didn't he say that? He says, it's coming, guys. I mean, they put the God of all creation to death on a cross. Who are we to think we're not going to get persecuted? It's ridiculous to even think that. Guzik also says, significantly, there was no attempt to replace James as there was to replace Judas. What do you reckon that was? Judas was replaced because he was a betrayer. He said, Guzik continues and he said, this is because James died a faithful martyr, but Judas revealed his apostasy in betraying Jesus. There was no need for another man to take the office of James. I'm kind of glad it did this way, because if we didn't, we would have everybody, we already have the Catholic Church saying the Pope is a direct descendant from Peter. And we already know, if you go through church history and look, that there are 15 different splits and different people saying their Pope was descendant of Peter. Could you imagine if everybody was trying to be descendant of one of the apostles? So I think God intentionally allowed this to happen and didn't mention any replacement for James because of that. Herod was on a roll with his opposition to the gospel and his confidence. He arrested and jailed Peter. Barnes said it was because he saw that it pleased the Jews. He said this was the principle which he acted. It's not a sense of right. It's not a sense to do justice. It's not to protect the innocent. It's not to discharge the appropriate duties of a magistrate and a king, but it was to promote his own popularity. Sounds familiar with politicians today, doesn't it? They'll throw anybody under the boat just to be popular. And I'm not just talking about Democrats. I'm talking about Republicans too. I'm not talking about any of the particular group. It happens both ways. It's disgusting. Said it's probable that Agrippa would have acted in the way in any circumstance. He was ambitious, vain, and fawning. He sought as his great principle of popularity, he was willing to sacrifice, like many others, truth and justice to obtain this end. But there is also a particular reason for this case. He held his appointment under the Roman emperor. The foreign rule was always unpopular among the Jews. In order, therefore, to secure a peaceful reign and to prevent insurrection and tumult, it was necessary for him to court their favor, to indulge their wishes, and to fall in with their prejudice. Alas, how many monarchs and rulers there have been who were governed by no better principle, whose sole aim was to be secure, popular, even at the expense of the law and truth and justice. This is what character of Herod attested to by Josephus. Now, who is Josephus? Josephus isn't a Christian. He was a Jewish writer during that day, and this is how he described him. He says, this King Herod Agrippa was by nature very beneficent and liberal in his gifts and very ambitious to please the people with such large donations. He made himself very illustrious, and many expensive presents he made. He took delight in giving and rejoiced in living a good reputation. That's the problem with all politics today. They're not servants anymore. Try not to get political now, but it just ticks me off. Our original founders were men who worked a full-time job and paid their own expense. And the lavishness of our people today is just sickening. Guzik said there's a significant difference between the persecution of Saul. We already read that one. He says, he had every intent on killing Peter, though, after the Passover. He said, look at what it said. He says, he saw and pleased the Jews to proceed to arrest Peter now during the days of unleavened bread. And so when he had seized him, he put him in prison and delivered him to the 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. He had plans, but what's going on? The Passover, right? That's when Jesus was murdered too during that time. And remember, the Jews were all particular, like you can't leave him on the tree during the Passover on the cross, so we're going to have to take him down. That's why they went and stabbed everybody in the side and broke the legs of the thieves, because they didn't want anybody hanging during the Passover. So he's like, I'll just put him in prison for right now. Guzik said, Hort suggests 3 reasons for the delay in executing Peter. Herod wanted to show how scrupulously he observed the Passover. Look, I'm a good Jew too. And y'all probably remember the picture of a famous politician who now his church is refusing him communion. Y'all remember the ash on the head? Plain church. And now his church says they will not serve him the sacraments in a Catholic church because of his view on abortion, because he thinks murdering babies is okay. Okay. He wanted to wait until the pilgrim crowd went home, fearing a riot. He said, these people that are coming into town don't care as much about these guys as the people in town. So we're going to wait till they leave, because if we do it right now, these people might show sympathy for him, so we're just going to wait until they get gone. Next, he wanted to wait until he had the full attention of the Jewish population. It's about me. I want to show you what I'm going to do. We'll hold a press conference, and we're going to talk about what we're going to do to Peter. He may have been planning to do to Peter what they did to James right there in the square. He might have done it himself, or commanded it right there, and we don't know. But Herod was going to make sure that Peter stayed. Stott said normally it considered enough for a prisoner to be handcuffed to one soldier, but a special precaution, Peter had a soldier on each side of him, and both his wrists were manacled. And Gill said he delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, and each quaternion consisted of 4 soldiers, so they were in all 16. 16 men for one lowly fisherman. You got anything on that, Tracy? This way you were moving, I didn't know. After the holiday, hustle and bustle was gone. Herod was going to bring Peter out, and he's going to have a show. In the King James, it says, I was saying earlier, the King James holiday says this is Easter. The word here used is Passover, but if you look on the translation, Easter is one that's used later on. Easter is a celebration at the same time, but Jews were not celebrating Easter. They were celebrating the Passover. So I guess they were thinking the writers of the gospel would be thinking about Easter, which they wouldn't have called it Easter at the time. Easter is a name that we placed on it later on, taken from a pagan holiday. I prefer to call it Resurrection Sunday, but sometimes I still call it Easter. So I don't know why the King James translated it Easter, except to try to put the Christian viewpoint on what holiday was going on. That's the only thing I can figure. If you go into the Greek and look at the Greek word and you do the search on the Greek word, it's the same word that we know for Passover. So it's not that important, but it's just that's what time it was of the year. So, and we know how many people come into town during the Passover. We know that from when Jesus was there, and that people came from all over to do their sacrifices. I mean, that's the times that he went and cleansed the temple, was during the Passover. Verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church of God. Peter's predicament prompted people to pray. And yes, I did that on purpose. Peter's predicament prompted people to pray. That is how we should pray. I mean, I'm glad to pray for people being sick, but I wish our hearts would be more concerned about spiritual things like Peter here. What's going on with Peter, praying for our missionaries, praying for each other's struggles and things like that. And I hope you pray for each other. I really do. And some of my hardest days is usually I get a text or a note from one of my preacher friends, especially Brother Drew. You know Drew Ham. Most of y'all know, some of you never met him. But Drew will text me and says, pray for you today. And man, how that lifts me up. I said, man, you must have, because the day I was having, I didn't realize I was going to get through it. But he lifted me up in prayer. It says he prayed for him and was being made fervently by the church. And the King James says, pray without ceasing, right? Or it say prayers made without ceasing. It's that same idea. The Greek word here signifies both fervor and earnestness as well as perseverance. These prayers for the church produced the miraculous interference mentioned below. Without Peter, Peter would not have escaped from the hands of the ruthless king. The fervent prayer of a righteous man and woman availeth much. Continue to pray for those in need. Continue to pray for Nathan and Candace. And it was nice having them here, and we prayed for them a lot right then. Continue to pray for them. And I've got friends in places that we can't mention. We need to continue to pray for those missionaries that are in places that we can't mention. Because if their name gets mentioned and it gets put on the internet and the governments hear their names and hear that they're missionaries, they'll either be run out or killed. We need to pray for those people with fervent prayer. Constant prayer was offered to God for him. The word constant, also an idea of earnest. Literally, the word picture means someone stretching out all they can for something. The verb is related to a medical term describing stretching out a muscle to its limits. As MacArthur said. It's the kind of fervent prayer. I think I mentioned to y'all before, we at Wray Crossroads, we had a witnessing night. You could do 4 things, and one of them was pray, one was make phone calls, and one was write letters, and one was actually going out and visiting. I forgot what it was called. Randy Mann, who did the revival here a while back, he was in charge of that. And I was going to a room to either write letters or to make phone calls, and I opened the door, and Tanya and Dowdu, and she's from the opposite side of Africa, found where the area that the Gideon came from, and she was in there praying. Let me tell you, that woman was praying. It was earnest. And I knew God had her ear. I was afraid God wouldn't be able to hear me because how she was praying. It was just that. I know he can hear me. That was sarcasm. But Tanya was praying with a fervency for the lost. And you could just tell that she knew who God was, and she knew that he could answer, and she knew she was pleading for those people. I kind of wish we were more that way. I hope whenever things after COVID finally get better and we start having more and more people in this church, and it's so full that we can't deal with it, and that we have people in the back praying. Maybe we should start that now. People praying during the service, taking time, sacrificing being in the church service to go pray. Or we were doing that before. I guess we need to probably intentionally start doing it now. The men were coming to pray early. And since all the COVID mess, a lot of things have fell by the wayside. But coming in and praying, I remember growing up walking to the prayer room in these independent Baptist churches. And there'd be 30, 40, 50 men in this prayer room. And you could feel the energy. And I'm a little boy, 6, 7 years old, and I could just feel that these men were seeking God's face. And it was pretty awesome. Well, who prayed? Who were the people that were praying? It was the church. The church was praying. The church of God. That's who was praying. If a lost person prays for something except for salvation, does God really hear them? No, right? These were people who were in touch with God. The church of God was praying. God calls us to pray because nobody else's prayers really makes a difference unless it's the prayer of repentance and salvation. So church, we're called to pray. How do they pray? Fervently without ceasing. They just kept on and kept on and kept on. And then next week we'll see how fervent it actually was. And it's amazing. And to be continued that we're going to see. We're almost done here. And McGee said another translation would be prayer made earnestly to the church of God for him. They did not come before God with a kind of grocery list prayer. They went before God earnestly and prayed that this man, Simon Peter, be delivered. Their hearts were in prayer. It was a unity of prayer, and it was a specific prayer. It wasn't just like, God bless all the missionaries. I mean, that's what you expect a 6-year-old child to do. And it's beautiful when a 6-year-old child does that, right? We feel that because that's how they understand. But as a 52-year-old man, am I 52 now? I guess I am. 52-year-old man, God bless all the missionaries isn't good enough. This needs to be a fervent prayer. And he said we need to pray with understanding who God is and what the need is and knowing that God can meet the need. Jesus said, much of prayer is powerless because it lacks earnestness. Too often we almost pray with an attitude of waiting for God to care about things we really don't care about too much about. Yeah, God, you know things are bad. Go ahead and do something there, I guess. I don't think we realize the lostness of the world and what's going to happen when people die without Christ. I really don't think we do. Music and sinners. Earnest prayer has power, not because it provides persuade a reluctant God. Instead, it demonstrates that our hearts care passionately about the things God cares about. Fulfilling Jesus' promise in you, in me, and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. That's when we get to see God really answer our prayers, is when we pray like He wants us to pray. That's how it's always shown us in Scriptures. He doesn't say you get what you want, right? It doesn't say name it and claim it. Don't tell God you want a new Mercedes and God's going to bring you a new Mercedes. God says, you get right with me, then you'll really start praying, and then you'll start getting what you want because you want what I want. Who did they pray to? God, right? Because what does it say here? It says, and being made firmly to the church to God. They didn't write their senators. They didn't do all that. They went to the ultimate source of power, to God. Jesus said constant prayer was offered to God. It's also important to see the church prayed to God. It may seem obvious, but often our prayers are weak because we are not constantly coming to the presence of a great and holy God, offering our requests to Him. Some of you may notice that my prayers in the last 6 months or so have changed, especially the way I start my prayers. I'm trying to use the same model as the Lord's Prayer. And our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And I do it in different ways of doing that. I do that intentionally. Because if I start my prayer focusing on the one who can answer the prayer, the one I should be praying to, and make Him the essence of the prayer, then my prayer starts to mean something. Because I believe in who I'm talking to. If I just start reading the list of needs, well, we need someone's kidney to get fixed, and we need the cancer healing, and this, that, and the other. You got that, God? All right. You got it right now? We checked off. We prayed for those things. Is that true prayer? Is it really going to mean anything? Use a continuous prayer offered to God. It's him by the church. In this contest, Herod had soldiers and his prisoners, but the church had the power of prayer. The outcome would soon be seen and easily decided. Peter was therefore kept in prison, but the church was free to pray. They say they took prayer out of school. As long as there's tests, there's always going to be prayer in school, right? And they can't stop you from praying. When you have somebody gets mad at you and somebody's lost in your family and don't talk to me anymore, you can still pray for them, right? They can't stop you from praying for them. They can't stop you from loving them. All right, continue on. When every other gate is shut and locked, the gate to heaven is open wide. Isn't that good news? We take advantage of the open gate through prayer. But what I love about this, there's a lot of times in the Scripture that God uses a 3-letter word to begin a phrase that means all the world. If we go to Ephesians chapter 2, which Chris broke on Sunday, the but God phrases, right? The but God. But here, but prayer is a foreshadowing of the soon coming display of God's power. It's almost the tensions starting to well up here. If this was a movie, the music would get really intense right now. And you know that episode 2 is coming because you're looking at your clock and there's only 5 minutes left in the episode. And you know that it's not going to get resolved yet. And then verse 6 starts, and it's kind of one of those verses that's going to start going on to start the next episode, get you ready for it. And listen to what it says. And verse foreshadow continues, it says, it's on that very night when Herod was about to bring him forward. Herod had his plans, right? Herod thought he was going to do it. After the holiday, right before Herod was about to do his evil deed, listen to this. Peter was sleeping. That's kind of funny to me. He was sleeping between two soldiers. And that kind of is like the foreshadowing what's going on. You see this picture of this happening. You can almost see it on the TV screen or the movie screen right now. Bound in 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. He's sitting there bound in chains, 2 chains in his hands and his feet, I'm sure. Guards, chained to guards. And you got guards all over the place. There's 16 of them. And they weren't just watching him, they were watching the prison, making sure nobody came and did anything about it. But what they didn't know is that the church wasn't coming. They were praying. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for the excitement that these verses build up to see what you're getting ready to do. Lord, calls us to trust you and everything. Calls us to be fervent prayers, Lord, amidst any persecution. Lord, instead of complaining about persecution, Lord, it calls us to pray. Lord, we know of many missionaries and others and friends, and even in America, Lord, that are suffering persecution, Lord. Calls us, Lord, to be like the church in Acts chapter 12, that will pray fervently for them, that will remember them and love on them, Lord. And ones that are going through these trials, that will pray for your intervention. And Lord, I'm excited next week to see and to show exactly what you did, Lord, that your intervention, Lord, when man thought he was in control and thought he could hurt your people, how you intervene. Thank you, Lord, for being the God that you are. And Lord, remind us to call on you. Remind us to fervently call on you for our own lives and for the lives of others. In Christ's name, amen.